Every single morning you open your eyes right now, the price at the gas pump is a little higher than it was the day before. Your grocery bill quietly climbs. The news cycles are moving so fast that most people can't even keep track of what war is being fought, where, and by whom. But here's the thing, what's happening right now in the Middle East isn't noise. It isn't background chatter. It is the most consequential geopolitical shift in decades, and it's playing out in real time, right in front of us, whether we're paying attention or not. We are watching the architecture of the global energy order being dismantled, piece by piece, on a narrow stretch of water called the Strait of Hormuz, a body of water so strategically vital that roughly 20% of the world's oil normally flows through it. And right now, that strait is effectively closed. Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu made a decision that has sent shockwaves through every market, every government, and every kitchen table in the world. And what you need to understand, and what most people are not telling you, is that this was not accidental. This was deliberate. This is a restructuring of power. And the question you should be sitting with right now is not whether this war will end. The question is, who benefits when it does, and at what cost to everyone else? Let me walk you through this slowly, because there are layers here that matter deeply if you actually want to understand what's going on. On the 28th of February 2026, the United States and Israel initiated coordinated airstrikes on Iran under Operation Epic Fury, targeting military facilities, nuclear sites, and leadership, resulting in the death of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. Let that sink in for a moment. The Supreme Leader of Iran, the man who had held the reins of one of the most strategically positioned nations on earth for decades, was killed in a coordinated American-Israeli military operation. This was not a small thing. This was not a tactical strike on a weapons depot. This was a decapitation of a government, a deliberate act of regime disruption with consequences that no one has yet fully mapped out. And the world's immediate response was chaos. In the markets, in the governments of neighboring countries, in the insurance firms that cover oil tankers, in the parliaments of Europe that suddenly found their gas storage at critically low levels. Iran responded the only way it could respond. Iran responded with missile barrages on Israeli cities and US bases in the Gulf, including in the UAE, Qatar, and Bahrain, causing casualties and infrastructure damage. And then Iran did something that sent the entire global economy into a cold sweat. It closed the Strait of Hormuz. Not symbolically, not with a press release. On the 2nd March 2026, a senior official in the IRGC officially confirmed that the strait was closed, subsequently threatening any ship that passed through it, and they meant it. As of 12th March 2026, Iran has made 21 confirmed attacks on merchant ships. Now, you might be thinking, well, the US military is powerful. Just go open the strait. That's exactly the kind of thinking that those in power are counting on. The reality is far more complicated and far more dangerous than that framing suggests. Reopening the Strait of Hormuz may be militarily possible, but it would likely be costly and time-consuming for the United States. Even attempting it could trigger a global economic shock. Persistent threats to shipping could take weeks or months to suppress, making long-term control impractical. And what does costly look like in real numbers? Oil prices surged faster than during any other conflict in recent history. Brent crude oil prices surpassed $100 per barrel on 8 March 2026 for the first time in 4 years, rising to $120 per barrel at its peak. The IEA called this situation the greatest global energy security challenge in history. That is not a statement from a fringe analyst or a think tank with an agenda. That is the International Energy Agency, the body created specifically to manage global energy stability. And they are using superlatives they have never used before. So let's talk about who is feeling this, because it's not just the Middle East, it's not just Asia, it's not just a problem for developing countries. The oil production of Kuwait, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates collectively dropped by a reported 6.7 million barrels per day by 10 March and by at least 10 million barrels per day as of 12 March. 10 million barrels per day pulled from the global market almost overnight. Think about what that means. The maritime blockade triggered a concurrent grocery supply emergency across Gulf Cooperation Council states, which rely on the strait for over 80% of their caloric intake. By mid-March, 70% of the region's food imports were disrupted, forcing retailers to airlift staples, resulting in a 40 to 120% spike in consumer prices. People in the Gulf are struggling to find food, and this is happening right now, in April 2026, as you watch this video. And Europe? The war has precipitated a second major energy crisis and subsequently economic crisis for Europe. primarily through the suspension of Qatari liquefied natural gas and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. The conflict coincided with historically low European gas storage levels, estimated at just 30% capacity following a harsh 2025-2026 winter. Europe barely survived the last energy crisis triggered by the war in Ukraine. Now they face another one, and their reserves are depleted, their political cohesion is fraying, and they have no good options on the table. The European Central Bank postponed its planned interest rate reductions, raising its 2026 inflation forecast and cutting GDP growth projections, with economists warning that energy-intensive economies face high risks of technical recession if the maritime blockade persists through the summer refill season. And what about America? Will gas prices at the pump have already crossed $4 a gallon? The price at the pump hit $4 a gallon, the highest level since 2022, the national average up more than $1 since before the war began. And if you talk to the people who actually trade oil and gas for a living, they are not reassured. US government officials and Wall Street analysts are starting to consider the prospect that oil prices might surge to an unprecedented $200 a barrel. $200 a barrel. If you want to understand what that means in human terms, it means that the costs of nearly everything you buy, food, clothing, medicine, heating your home, would spike in ways that would make the inflation of 2022 look mild by comparison. Now let's pull back and look at the strategic logic here, because this is where it gets genuinely important to understand what Trump and Netanyahu are actually doing and what their endgame might be. And I want to be careful here because this is a question that deserves serious analysis, not tribal cheerleading in either direction. Trump has been making statements that swing wildly between diplomatic optimism and raw military threat. One day he says a deal is close, the next day he is threatening to destroy Iran's power plants and desalination infrastructure. The US now has hundreds of special operations forces in the Middle East as President Trump threatens to take the oil in Iran, with ground forces possibly being used to seize vital Iranian infrastructure. Seize the oil, that's the language being used in public, and this is not just bluster. Earlier comments to the Financial Times suggested American troops could seize Iran's Karg Island oil export hub, Karg Island. If you know anything about Iran's oil infrastructure, you know that Karg Island handles the vast majority of Iran's crude oil exports. Seizing it would be an act of war that goes far beyond anything the United States has done militarily since the invasion of Iraq. It would represent an occupation of sovereign territory for the explicit purpose of controlling energy resources. That is not a small thing. That is the kind of thing that changes the global order for generations, and Iran is not backing down. Tehran is not playing the role of the weaker party that simply accepts American ultimatums. Iran has warned that it is waiting for the arrival of US forces to set them on fire and punish their regional partners forever. Iran's parliament speaker dismissed the talks facilitated by Pakistan as cover for American troop deployments. And here is the thing about Iran's strategic position that most American commentators completely miss. Iran has a geographic and military advantage in the strait that is not easily overcome by American firepower alone. Even attempting it could trigger a global economic crisis. The US can bomb targets. It has done so. Approximately 6,000 targets across Iran have been struck since the operation commenced on 28 February 2026, 6,000 targets, and yet the strait remains effectively closed, and yet Hezbollah is still firing rockets into northern Israel. And yet Iran's proxy networks continue to operate across the region, which brings us to Hezbollah, because you cannot understand this conflict without understanding what is happening in Lebanon right now. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has instructed his country's military to further expand invasions of southern Lebanon, pushing forward his country's stated bid to replicate the Gaza model of occupation. The Gaza model, that phrase alone should stop you cold. Israel flattened Gaza, it displaced millions of people, it generated international condemnation on a scale rarely seen, and now Netanyahu is openly saying he wants to do the same thing in southern Lebanon. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz says Israel's military is accelerating the destruction of Lebanese homes in accordance with tactics used in Gaza, where residential areas were razed to prevent militants from returning. The scale of displacement in Lebanon is staggering. The Israeli invasion of Lebanon, aimed at ousting Iranian-backed Hezbollah militants, has triggered one of the biggest and fastest displacements in Lebanon's history, affecting more than 1 million people, or about a fifth of the population. 1 in 5 Lebanese people has been displaced. Think about that proportion applied to the United States. That would be 66 million Americans forced from their homes, bridges destroyed, roads cut off, entire villages razed, and the explicit plan is long-term control. Defense Minister Israel Katz said Israel's military would occupy a swathe of southern Lebanon even after the end of the current war against Hezbollah. This is not a temporary military operation. This is territorial ambition being dressed up in the language of security, and Netanyahu himself has been remarkably candid about the broader strategic vision. When asked about long-term solutions to the oil routes problem created by Iran's closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the Prime Minister floated the idea to divert all the energy pipelines, oil and gas, from the Gulf, where the Iranians have a geographic choke point, to across Saudi Arabia, to the Red Sea, and up there to the Mediterranean port, our ports in Israel. Read that again slowly. Netanyahu is describing a future in which Israeli ports become the transit point for Gulf oil flowing to the world. That is not a defensive security measure. That is a geopolitical restructuring of enormous proportions. That is Israel positioning itself at the center of the global energy trade. And it would require a Middle East where Iran's power has been permanently broken, where Hezbollah has been dismantled as a military force, and where Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states are so deeply integrated into Israeli-American economic architecture that they have no choice but to play along. This is the plan that is being executed. This is not conspiracy theory. This is not speculation. It is being stated openly by the people implementing it. And the human cost is being paid right now every single day in the form of Lebanese families who don't know if they'll ever go home, Iranian civilians navigating an internet blackout and airstrikes, Gulf workers fleeing the region by the hundreds of thousands, and American families quietly absorbing rising prices at every checkout line. Now, what does the diplomatic track actually look like? Trump has repeatedly claimed progress is being made. But Iran's foreign ministry spokesman said Tehran had received a 15-point proposal from the Trump administration containing excessive, unrealistic, and irrational demands, while denying there had been any direct talks. 15 points. Iran called them excessive and irrational. And Iran has a point worth considering. As they noted, the US had twice launched strikes on Iran while engaging in diplomacy, once in June 2025 when it joined Israeli attacks on Iranian nuclear facilities, and again on February 28 when it launched the ongoing war. Why would Iran trust a negotiating partner that has twice bombed them during active diplomatic engagement? The answer is they don't. And so you have a situation where both sides are talking about talking while the bombs keep falling and the strait stays closed. The deadline game has become almost surreal. Earlier this week, President Trump said Friday was the deadline for Iran to open the Strait of Hormuz or face a resumption of attacks on energy infrastructure. Late Thursday, Trump said he's extending his deadline until April 6th, extensions of extensions, deadlines that pass without consequence followed by new deadlines. This pattern tells you something important. The military option for forcing open the strait is genuinely costly, and the economic consequences of escalation are already being felt domestically in ways the administration cannot ignore forever. And yet the war machine does not stop. The United States has begun drawing down barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, Energy Secretary Chris Wright told oil and gas executives, with releases expected to reach as much as 1.5 million barrels per day. That's emergency infrastructure being tapped to manage what is already an emergency. And the Trump administration has already lifted some U.S. sanctions on Russian crude to make it easier for those barrels to make it to market. Think about the irony there for a moment. The same administration that spent years sanctioning Russia is now quietly lifting those sanctions to access Russian oil because Iranian oil can't flow. Global power politics has no permanent friends and no permanent enemies, only permanent interests. And right now, everyone's interest is in getting oil to flow somewhere, somehow, to prevent the economic shock from becoming something truly catastrophic. The head of the IEA described what is happening as the largest energy security challenge in history. Many drew parallels with the 1970s oil shock, warning a prolonged closure of the Strait of Hormuz would threaten an even bigger crisis. And if you were alive during the 1970s or you've studied that period, you know what it did to the American economy. Gas lines stretching around city blocks, inflation that took a decade to tame, political upheaval, a loss of public confidence in institutions. We are looking at a version of that scenario unfolding right now, except in a world that is far more interconnected, far more financially leveraged, and far less capable of absorbing supply shocks without serious political consequences. The deeper question, the one that keeps coming back to me as I look at all of this, is what vision of the world is actually being built here. The people making these decisions, Trump, Netanyahu, the planners behind Operation Epic Fury, they are not improvising. They have a picture in their minds of what the Middle East looks like on the other side of this conflict, and it is a Middle East where Iran's nuclear capability has been permanently set back, where Hezbollah has been removed as a military threat to Israel's north, where oil routes no longer run through a choke point controlled by a hostile power, and where American and Israeli influence over the region's energy infrastructure has been locked in for a generation. That is the prize they are pursuing. The question is what it costs to get there, and whether the cost in human lives, in economic damage, in global stability, is a price that anyone beyond the decision makers actually agreed to pay. Because here's what I think you need to sit with as an American watching this unfold. The gas you pump today costs more because of decisions made in your name. The global food prices that are rising right now, rising across Asia, across Africa, across the Gulf, are rising because of a war launched on February 28, 2026, with American B-2 bombers and American political will. Trump said Israel would have been wiped out if the US didn't send B-2 bombers to Iran, seemingly referring to an earlier set of June 2025 strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities. And maybe that is true. Maybe the nuclear threat from Iran was real enough to justify this response. But that is precisely the kind of claim that deserves scrutiny, not simply acceptance. Because the consequences of this war are global, and they are real, and they are landing on people who had no say in the decision. What happens next is genuinely uncertain. Trump says the war could wrap up in 2 to 3 weeks. Iran says it is ready to fight a ground war. Hezbollah says it will make the Lebanese invasion costly for Israel. The Houthis in Yemen have entered the conflict on Iran's side. Saudi Arabia is intercepting Iranian missiles fired at its oil infrastructure. Iran has threatened to launch its own ground invasion of Gulf Arab countries and mine the Persian Gulf if US troops set foot on its territory. The vectors of escalation are multiplying faster than the vectors of de-escalation, and the diplomacy that is supposedly happening, the talks through Pakistan, the messages through back channels, is happening in the shadow of bombs dropping on Isfahan and rockets falling on northern Israel. What you are watching is not simply a war, it is a renegotiation of the global order conducted at gunpoint with oil as the leverage and human lives as the cost of entry. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a geographic choke point. It is the hinge on which the entire post-war global economy has rested for decades, and right now that hinge is being forced open or permanently realigned by decisions made in Washington and Tel Aviv. Whether that realignment produces a more stable world or a more dangerous one, that is the question history will answer. But it will be answered in real time, in your lifetime, with consequences you are already beginning to feel every time you fill your tank.